Lonscopolia, a protected wetland in Croatia. It's early May. The meadows and forests have been flooded for weeks now. Life here is shaped by the water, which is responsible for the biodiversity. And the people live in harmony with this landscape. In Persavian, the valley of the Sava, southeast of Sisak. Shortly after sunrise in Lonjskopolia, a pig is already out and about, enjoying the early light. Fresh rushes are particularly tasty at this time. The Polie is a unique paradise for birds, particularly in spring. Black and white storks hunt together in the wetlands, and always in the company of several herons. There are pools and small tarns everywhere now, with fish left behind after the Sava flooded. Amphibians and insect larvae can be found here in large numbers. It's a land of plenty. The black stork is searching the shallow water for prey. With so much on offer, he always catches something in his beak. The delicate little egrets are pickier. They only eat small animals of up to 20 grams and 10 centimeters in length. The fish, amphibians and insects develop rapidly in the shallow warm water. Each individual pond can contain up to 50 birds at any one time. They have to hurry, because in just a few days' time, the water may have evaporated, taking away this plethora of food. The wild animals aren't alone in Lonscopolia. Human hands have been shaping the landscape for centuries. The Polie is pastureland. Hundreds of pigs, horses and cattle roam the meadows and forests from May onwards, leading a wild and free life during the summer. The farmers regularly visit their animals to prevent them from becoming altogether feral. In winter, they have to return to their farms. Only the dairy cows are let out during the day and brought back in again in the evening. But only a few elderly farmers still make this effort. Most of the younger ones have a job alongside agriculture, but they aren't willing or able to say goodbye to the old traditions. Like their ancestors, they subscribe to the traditional method of keeping grazing animals, the Persavian method. The storks are just as much part of Lonscopolia as the grazing animals are. Some villages have more storks than people. Many farms have several nests. Life in the village along the Sava is now a mix of tradition and modernity. Many of the timber houses are several hundred years old. The older population are particularly likely to uphold traditions. Take Ivan Lončarevich and his wife Anna, for example. They're both over 70, but they still grow all their animal feed and couldn't imagine a life without agriculture.
I've worked in agriculture since I've been able to work. I like this work and won't give up this life.
A few days ago, a cow had a calf. The Loncharevichs still treat their animals as individuals, not as intensively reared anonymous meat producers. Ivan and Anna have been married for more than 50 years. She was 15, he was 17. They've built the farm together and still do all the work themselves.
I
do everything with my husband. When he needs help with cleaning out the cowshed or milking the cow, for example, after she's had a calf, I help. We let our cows live outside, just like the pigs and poultry.
The effort's worth it because their animals lead a life that's appropriate for their species. They only spend time in their sheds in the winter months. Swallows are nesting in the sheds and barns, while the chickens come and go as they please. In a few days' time, Ivan will take the cattle out to the Polie. By then, the calf has to be strong and steady on its legs, so it can follow the herd everywhere. The villages of the Posavina still exude an air of agricultural tranquility. The clocks run slower here than in the constant restlessness of the towns. It's a place of peace and quiet for visitors. Every farm has its own flock of chickens. Like all the other animals, these feathered creatures lead a carefree life. A long mane and gentle eyes. Until a few decades ago, the Persavian horse, the Posavak, a small, heavy but agile horse, shaped the Sava floodplains. Miodrag Begovic, usually known as Miško, is the president of the Donja Posavina, a Croatian association of horse breeders that aims to prevent the endangered Posavaks from going extinct. By mid-May, most of the mares already have their foals. That's why the herd will soon be going out into the Polie. Miško was an electrical engineer at first, but he was drawn to the countryside. So in the year 2000, he bought an old, derelict farmhouse and restored it. Then he started breeding Posavaks. Posavaks are small, enduring, and good-natured. For centuries, they were the farmers' typical workhorses. Miško's one of the youngest ones here. Many have moved away because traditional agriculture doesn't bring in enough money. But despite all the changes in recent decades, life in the villages of Lonscopolia still possesses the typical rural atmosphere that existed in industrialized nations such as Germany, Britain, and France until the mid-20th century. The old framed houses in villages such as Chigoch have timbers that came from the alluvial forests of the Sava. The intention is that old things will continue to exist alongside the new in the future. Almost all the farmhouse roofs now have storks. Some have already had their first chicks. That's the peace and quiet gone for the parents. The little ones will have an insatiable appetite for the next 8 to 10 weeks. Again and again the stork parents bring material for the nest to bolster it for the delicate chicks still only a few days old. The nests look unappetizing and uncomfortable from the outside. But on the inside, they're quite soft and warm. One parent will always stay nearby to look after the young. Towards noon, many storks arrive from the Polie and bring food and water. Stork nests are communal places. There are always several sparrow families living here as lodgers. This pair have already dealt with the first brood and are passionately preparing the next one. The male stork meanwhile tries to steal twigs from the neighboring nest. It's a behavior that's widespread among birds breeding in colonies. Success at last, and now for a quick getaway before the neighbor gets back. Storks constantly expand their nests. Over the years and decades, a nest can become several meters high and weigh up to 2 tons. While the storks take care of their young on the roofs, village life takes place down below. A lot of people in Persavian are still self-sufficient and own at least 1 cow, 1 pig, or a flock of chickens. The transition between gardens and the small fields is usually seamless. The arable crops for the animals are grown here without pesticides and fertilizers. No one has to go very far. That saves energy. A herd of Hungarian grey cattle are grazing in the Croatia Dol, ensuring that this internationally important bird sanctuary is conserved, a colony with at least 6 European heron species. There are plenty of grey herons, great white egrets and little egrets, but the Eurasian spoonbill, which is endangered in Europe, is particularly at home here. Spoonbills are dependent on wet pasture land, particularly within the immediate vicinity of their breeding colonies. The area was at risk of drying out in the late 80s. The Eurasian spoonbills disappeared. But sustainable conservation measures and the foundation Euronatur made sure that the rare herons returned and started breeding here again. Even the glossy ibis, bird of the gods in ancient Egypt, can regularly be found in the Croatia Dol. Representing all the other endangered species, the Eurasian spoonbill adorns the emblem of the Lonscopolia Nature Park. The strange bird with the spoon-like beak is an indicator of intact marshlands. Almost all the villages in the Lonscopolia are on the water to a greater or lesser extent. The many tarns, oxbow lakes and pools foster species diversity in the region. Pond turtles have gone extinct in large areas of Central and Western Europe because bodies of water have been transformed and drained. However, in the Sava floodplains, this reptile is still abundant. Even though the Sava was made navigable a long time ago and was even dammed in the 1970s, most oxbow lakes remained in place. They still line the villages today. It's mid-May. The time has come for Ivan to take his cattle to their summer pastures. Since his farm's on the other side of the Sava, he has to use the ferry. The animals are excited. They know they're heading out to the Polie. Finally, they can enjoy life in the great outdoors again. Ivan's also happy about that.
I drive the herd out onto the Lonscopolia in spring. I then see to the farming. It's relaxing to head out to the Lonscopolia. If I see something that needs doing, I'll do it. If nothing needs to be done, that's fine too. I'm happy. But if you have your animals in sheds, you have to work all the time.
This year, the flood was particularly high. It took a long time for the water to subside. The land is still flooded over large areas. The ground is muddy and wet. A flood like this has advantages and disadvantages. Although the animals can only get out late, the high water also helps the regeneration of the forests and meadows. 2 months earlier, at the end of March, the land's underwater. There was a lot of rain in recent months, including in the upper reaches of the Sava. The water has come all the way to here with the flood. Some animals are even outside in the winter. A farmer from Mustsilovcica doesn't have enough shed space for his pigs at home. The water's climbed to the threshold of their hut, but they're all in good health. This year, the water's 2 meters high in the forests and meadows over an area of more than 300 square kilometers. That's not a problem for the fishermen's huts. The people here know their river and have adapted to its moods. But the late arrival of winter has proved difficult for the storks. Although it doesn't look it right now, spring is just around the corner. We're in southern Europe, at 45 degrees north after all. A few weeks later, in May, the animal residents of the Lonscopolia are benefiting from the big flood, the storks in particular. They can expect a plentiful supply of food, and therefore a good success rate with their offspring. That's also true for the shy relative of the white stork, which lives a reclusive life in the alluvial forests. The black stork is dependent on relatively open, natural forests with lots of water. Unlike its white relative, it eats hardly any mice and reptiles. It prefers fish, amphibians, and water insects. They're developing particularly well this year. The black stork's young are due to hatch in the coming days. The storks aren't alone in their forest anymore. Many herds of cattle are now roaming wild. There are more than 3,000 animals populating the forests and meadows of the Polie every summer. Several small herds owned by different farmers join together into larger ones. Every herd has a territory where they occasionally go on large migrations. This is a good place to observe cattle in their natural behavior. Over the coming days, the animals will go crazy about the fresh green shoots. Finally, they don't have to eat last year's hay anymore. They can enjoy fresh, juicy leaves and twigs. The Sava and its tributaries, the Lonya and Trebeș, have returned to their riverbeds. It's the end of May. The situation becomes easier by the day. The fishermen's huts are dry again too. The summer snowflake blossoms in the alluvial forests around the Sava at this time of year. It's closely related to the spring snowflake, both of which are toxic. During the day, the horses are sent into the forest to protect them from the ever more powerful sun. The foals are still delicate and need shade. The abundance of blossoms and insects is increasing. Summer's just around the corner. The warm weather is also causing the amphibian population to explode. That's good for hungry predators. The grass snake approaches almost silently. The frog should be easy prey. Unimpressed by all this, a family of pigs are dozing in the noon sun. The grass snake can't harm them anyway. But then someone gets in the way after all. The farmer's visiting his pigs. The snake goes rigid. The boats are coming right towards it. The pigs, meanwhile, are looking forward to the extra portion of maize. Even though they can find enough larvae and roots here, the farmer can make sure his animals won't forget him and go feral. His heart belongs to the Sava. That's always been the case. Nikola Jankovic is on the river almost every day. Despite being 80 years old, he's a fisherman. For a period, he had to be away from this area. He spent a few years working in Germany, for example. But in 1996, Nikola returned to his river for good, sharing it with white-tailed eagles, herons, and other fish hunters. He regularly places and checks his fish traps. The nets are empty today, but he's not bothered. He's not dependent on his catch. Often the fish aren't even the reason why he comes here.
I've always liked the Sava, especially in early spring when the willow has its scent. I like coming here during that time. Sometimes I don't even put up traps or nets. I just come for a little boat trip or to sit and watch the river. I enjoy it.
The Sava is Nikola's elixir. On warm spring afternoons, an unusual concert can be heard in the alluvial forests. The mating ritual of the European fire-bellied toads has begun. There's a male every 2 to 3 meters sitting on the shallow water, calling. The black storks still on the nest. After more than 5 weeks of brooding, the young should hatch any day now. And indeed, Almost invisible, there's a small yellow beak moving behind the edge of the nest. The adult storks keep a food reserve in the nest while sitting on the brood. That way, they don't have to leave the nest and put the eggs and young at risk. The chick's only a few hours old. Its siblings will hatch in the coming days. Since the female starts brooding after laying the second egg, the first chick is often up to a week older than the last one to hatch. That's why the youngest ones stand almost no chance of survival in bad years. Marsh Spurge is flowering in the forests. In the past, it used to be widespread all over Europe's floodplains. But because of modern agriculture, it's disappeared in many places. The tort's mating ritual reaches its climax on balmy evenings. The primeval amphibians pumped their lungs full of air before expelling it fully via their vocal sacs to produce a bell-like sound. They do that up to 40 times per minute. Such exertion requires an energy boost. The Lonscopolia is one of Europe's most primeval alluvial and cultivated landscapes. Intact habitats and traditional ways of life are often sacrificed to progress. Cost to humans and the environment tends to be overlooked. The Euro-Natur Foundation has designated the village of Chigoch, a European stork village, to highlight the significance of the Lonjsko Polie. Chigoch was the first place to be awarded this distinction. More than a dozen followed. These stork villages are supposed to emphasize the significance and diversity of the meadows and fields in Europe. From the floodplains of the Sava to the steppes in Spain's Extremadura. Chigoch is definitely one of the most beautiful among them. Summer in the Polie. Farmer Chelko Stremic is calling his pigs for his weekly visit, with a sack of maize to bribe them, of course. The pigs immediately come running and throw themselves onto the tasty treat. In the past, the Lonscopolia was largely inhabited by Turopolia pigs. They were ideal for living on the floodplains all year round. They were bred as early as the 14th century. Today it's tough to find pure breeds. Chelko is in a hurry. He's doing a deal with another farmer. He wants to sell cattle. The interested party wants to buy young cattle to keep in sheds. But the negotiations are tough. The buyer doesn't think the animals are fat enough. That's not least because the animals move around a lot outside. But Chelko is convinced by his way of keeping animals.
I enjoy it when I come here and get a complete overview of my animals. My heart and soul relaxes when I see every animal breathing. You take a look and that relaxes you. You feel lighter. It's important to me that the cows don't spend much time in the sheds. It's better for them to be outside. That also means that they supply pure organic meat.
Summer's in full swing. There are more storks on the roofs of Chigoch than there have been for a long time. 173 white storks, as against 90 people, a ratio of almost 2 to 1. That many young are always hungry. The stork parents get almost no break. Many nests have 5 or even 6 young storks. It's not always harmonious. Here, 2 are fighting over an adult grass snake. Grass snakes are particularly popular with white storks. The older one wins in the end. The young storks have to be supplied with food, but also with plenty of water. Now in July, the temperature often reaches more than 35 degrees in the shade. Pigs aren't familiar with problems like that. They always find a puddle in which they can roll around and dig to their heart's content. What would a poor indoor pig give to roll around so pleasurably in the mud? Flies are also thirsty in weather like this, much to the delight of the young frogs. You can't always be successful. These frogs hunt in water. But that's associated with risks. A great white egret is looking for prey. But he'll have to make do with tadpoles today. The green sandpiper also has tadpoles on the menu, and the pond's full of them. Meanwhile, there's a new danger in the reeds, although maybe it's one that's too noisy and conspicuous. The group of frogs have long since noticed the intruder. But the young little bittern has set its sights on a fat adult frog. No luck. The marshes of the Lonscopolia are full of life in the summer months. There's an overabundance of predators and prey. Be it a little crake or a kingfisher. They've all got their preferences and strategies. The delicate little egrets like to follow digging pigs. They don't let all this hustle and bustle bother them. They're just enjoying the summer. Suddenly, some of the birds become restless. Miško is chugging through the Polie on his motorbike. He wants to check on his horses, escorted by a small group of pigs who are racing this unfamiliar vehicle. The horses can hear the motorbike from a long way off and wait for their owner. During the hot midday hours, they tend to spend time in the forest. Miško knows where they like to be, but he can't ever be certain because out there, the herd goes where it pleases. Despite all his enthusiasm for and commitment to his Persavian horses, Miško is plagued by doubts about their future. Economically, this lovable breed has become almost completely insignificant.
Sometimes it's possible to earn a bit of money from selling them, but it's not a lot. This job will die out over time, and there'll be fewer and fewer horses on the meadows. The herds are becoming smaller every year. We had 450 animals last year. This year, we've got 150 fewer.
There's less and less point in breeding them. For centuries, the Posavaks were popular both as agile war horses that could pull cannon and as docile, willing workhorses. Today, they're being replaced by tractors. Their time, like that of the Turopolia pigs, is coming to an end, it seems. There are only between 15 and 1900 horses in the entire Lonscopolia region. Most owners keep them out of conviction. But will they be able to live off them in the future? But maybe this pleasant workhorse will experience a renaissance as a riding horse or coach horse. The dung of these horses attracts Camberwell beauties. With a wingspan of up to 7.5 centimeters, it's one of the largest European butterflies. They're happiest in light broadleaf forest, such as this one. Since this habitat is experiencing more and more destruction, Camberwell beauties, also known as mourning cloaks, have become rare in large parts of Europe. The alluvial forest of the Lonscopolia feels like a dense wild jungle in the summer. These forests were once Europe's answer to the Amazon, but most of them have been destroyed. Here on the Sava, there are still around 10,000 hectares of relatively pristine alluvial forest. They're a valuable place of refuge for the shy black storks. The young birds have developed well and will fledge in a few weeks. They'll gradually pluck the white down feathers of their juvenile plumage. Their parents are constantly busy getting food and water. The food is quickly regurgitated into the nest. It's predominantly fish, frogs and water insects, which the young greedily devour. They have to get going again. 5 hungry young storks don't leave time for idleness. After the meal, the young turn to looking after their plumage again. In a good 4 weeks, they'll fly to their winter quarters in Africa for the first time. A young starling is curiously peeping out of his nest, keenly watched by a young buzzard. The young starlings will also leave their nest in a few days' time. Alluvial forests are among the most biodiverse and also most threatened habitats in Europe. Until a few centuries ago, they covered large swathes of the continent. River diversion and land drainage have destroyed most of them, however, especially in Western Europe. The Sava floodplains demonstrate what river landscapes used to look like, what abundance of flora and fauna they had, and that people can live well with them. Although large alluvial forests have been lost in the Lonscopolia too, the forests that are still there possess a high ecological potential and could develop into proper jungles again. Floodplains are habitats full of natural wonders. Towards the evening, the big herds of horses leave the forests and move out onto the meadows to graze. The black stork brings one last food ration to the nest. But the farmers can't stop working yet. The hay has to be brought in before the night's dampness sets in and reduces its quality. The farmers help each other with the hay harvest. The whole family gets involved. They're particularly worried about the hay going moldy. Then the valuable feed for the winter would be lost. At this time of year, the farmers work every evening until dark. It's the most exhausting time in their calendar. Night falls quickly. A pale full moon shines on the meadows of the Lonscopolia. The next morning, fog drifts over the floodplains, as is so often the case. The summer is coming to an end. At this time of year, there's more and more fog, and it doesn't clear as readily. Eurasian spoonbills are becoming an increasingly rare sight at the few pools still present. They search for frogs and water insects together with the herons. A pig is enjoying digging for scarab larvae and roots. Again, it becomes clear how closely the lives of wild animals and livestock are intertwined in the Lonscopolia. All this abundance of food is provided by the regular returns of the Sava floods. Without them, the land here would be barren and poor. It's only the regular high water that guarantees that hundreds of storks, herons, eagles and many other creatures tied to the water can come to the Lonscopolia to raise their young. Plans to build a Danube-Sava canal to the Adriatic have been around for a while now. If they were to be implemented, it would be the death blow for this unique habitat. It would be the end of this wealth of plants, birds, and other animals that are desperately reliant on wetlands such as this one. Storks and herons would soon disappear. In addition, it would mark the end of traditional grazing practices that have existed here for centuries. Man and nature act hand in hand in the Lonscopolia. They're directly dependent on each other. So we can only hope that such plans, whose economic feasibility is also in question, by the way, are never implemented. Right now, the Sava still meanders into the Danube, along with the seasonal fluctuations in water levels that are natural for rivers. Even fish hunters like kingfishers and cormorants are still plentiful. And there are still plenty of fish. More than 40 species live in the river. Fisherman Nicola is out on the Sava this evening. He wants to catch catfish. He's using freshwater pearl mussels as bait. He cleverly picks them out of the sand on the Sava's banks. He attaches the flesh of the mussels to a hook that he'll later hang overboard to dangle in the water as the boat drifts downriver.
I couldn't live without the Sava. I'm used to life with this river. I love it, and it's my main occupation. I prefer watching the Sava to watching television. It's much more interesting.
Nicola likes fishing using the traditional method. He taps the water with a wooden stick to attract the catfish. It's not clear what the tapping does to the fish, but it's a proven method and the fishermen are convinced of it. Now in the evening, the birds become active again too. The herons have gathered on an island in the Krapje Dol. The rare and shy black-crowned night heron can also be found among its bigger relatives. In 1972, people started draining huge tracts of land around the Sava. But even during the planning phase, it became clear that a river that had been channelized wouldn't be able to cope with the quantities of water that the Sava transported to the Danube. In order to protect the towns and fields, large floodplains are needed. That's why the Lonscopolia has remained in place as a diked marsh and bird paradise. The floodplains of the Sava can store a total of 2 billion cubic meters of water. That's why there have never been any dramatic floods, unlike with many other major rivers in Europe. The Sava is now considered an outstanding example of flood protection by other countries. In Germany, for example, large parts of the Elbe floodplains are naturalized again, because people have recognized that this form of flood protection is the best and most sustainable. This gives nature a place of peace and quiet, and of wilderness in a globalized, urbanized world. The late summer languishes over the Polie. Once again, the farmers go out to check on their animals, just like they always have done. The Lonjsko Polie is one of the most primeval floodplains and cultivated landscapes in Europe. This form of managing the land goes back to at least the time of the Austro-Turkish Wars between the 14th and 18th centuries, and probably even further. Instead of recklessly transforming and exploiting the natural world, humans have chosen to work with it here and have benefited greatly as a result. Hopefully, the 21st century will still see horses and cattle and pigs roaming the Lonjsko Polie, spending their summers in freedom, because the result of this measured approach to the environment is a biodiversity that's hard to find anymore. The Euro-Natur Foundation, the Croatian state and the EU are at pains to conserve the tradition and culture here. They're supporting the farmers financially too. In material terms, it's definitely a modest life in the basic wooden houses, always exposed to nature's whims. But it's also a unique gift. The storks are still in the villages. Hopefully, that'll never change in the Lonjsko Polie, Croatia's green heart.